Welcome to our lesson on levels of organisation. The key questions for today are: how do food chains show feeding relationships? What is a producer? What is a consumer? What is a predator? What is a prey? The key words you will need to know are producer, consumer, herbivore, carnivore, apex predator. All ecosystems depend on organisms called producers. These are organisms that are able to synthesize their own food in the form of glucose by a process called photosynthesis. This means that these organisms do not need to eat like us to get their food. They make it themselves using the energy from the sun, water, and carbon dioxide. The products in this reaction are glucose and oxygen. The oxygen is released into the surroundings, and the glucose is used by the organism for energy or stored until it is needed. This means that the energy that all ecosystems rely on initially comes from the sun. Task: can you think of any organisms that would be called producers? Remember, they are organisms that carry out photosynthesis. Green plants, algae, and phytoplankton carry out photosynthesis, so they are producers. Producers provide a food source for organisms called consumers. The consumers will eat the plants or algae as their food to use as energy, as they cannot produce the food themselves. Consumers break down the food that they consume in a process called digestion, which then allows them to use the glucose for energy. So the producer makes the glucose and a consumer then eats it, breaking it down for energy themselves. This is how a food chain develops. The consumer that eats the plant or algae is called a primary consumer. The primary consumers are often herbivores, meaning they only eat plants. Task: can you think of an example of a primary consumer? Organisms that eat plants are primary consumers. These include insects, who often eat leaves from plants or nectar from flowers. Animals such as rabbits, who eat grass and other plants, as well as some crustaceans in the sea who feed off the phytoplankton. Primary consumers are often prey animals. This means they are hunted for food by other animals. The next level in the food chain is called the secondary consumer. These are often omnivores, meaning they eat both plants and animals. The secondary consumer eats the primary consumer in the way a bird may eat an insect. Task: can you think of a secondary consumer? Secondary consumers are often birds, frogs, or snakes. They are predators of another organism. The organism that eats the secondary consumer is called a tertiary consumer. These are often the top of the food chain, as the energy transfer is very inefficient as you move up the food chain. This means that if another organism was to eat the tertiary consumer, it often would use more energy catching and killing it than it would actually gain. This is why other animals don't chase, fight, and then eat tigers. It would use too much energy. Task: can you think of a tertiary consumer? Tertiary consumers are often top carnivores or apex predators. This means that they only eat meat and are not hunted by other animals. Examples include tigers, lions, wolves, and predatory birds like hawks and eagles. The organisms in an ecosystem can be arranged into a food chain. The food chain always starts with the producer, followed by the primary consumer, then the secondary consumer, then the tertiary consumer. Arrows are placed between them to show the direction of energy flow. So think of the arrow as saying, is eaten by, and this will help you to make sense of a food chain. This food chain shows that the plant is eaten by the mouse is eaten by the snake, and the snake is eaten by the hawk. Extension. Can you create your own version of a food chain? When studying an ecosystem, scientists sometimes need to measure the abundance of an organism. This means finding out how many of them there are. This can be done using a method of sampling called quadrat sampling. This is discussed in the Levels of Organisation 2 lesson. Organisms within a food chain depend on those in the level below for their food. This is why populations fluctuate. This is called predator-prey cycles, and they occur because when the prey is abundant, the population of predators increases as there is lots of food. However, then the larger population of predators eat the prey much quicker, causing the prey population to decrease. This in turn causes the predator population to decrease as there is less food available. This means that the population of prey can increase again as they are not being eaten as quickly. Task. Answer this exam question. Some small mites feed on the leaves of orange plants. Larger mites feed on the smaller mites. A. What do we call animals like the large mite which eat other animals like the small mite? The graph shows how the number of these mites change over a period of time. B. What happens to the number of large mites 1 week after the number of small mites decreases? Extension. Explain the changes in the population of large mites and small mites. A. The large mites are predators. B. The number of large mites decreases. The number of large mites increases when the number of small mites increases as there is more food for them. But when the number of small mites decreases, the number of large mites also decreases as there is less food for them and some will starve and die. When there is less large mites, the number of small mites increases as they are not being eaten as quickly. But as the number of small mites increases, the number of large mites then begins to increase too as there is more food for them.